Madam President, before I begin, I would like to express my fundamental disagreement with the President's approach to inviting delegations to today's meeting under Rule 37. In a break with established practice, the Danish presidency has unilaterally decided to allow 4 EU and NATO states, as well as a representative of the EU itself, to speak today. We have repeatedly noted that inviting such a large number of participants, and even guided by bloc discipline, does not bring any added value to our conversation. On the other hand, your actions, contrary to your own working methods common among us, will lead to a protracted discussion, in fact, turning it into a debate that Denmark did not coordinate with the members of the Security Council. We see in this not only the unscrupulousness of the presidency, but also an attempt to put pressure on the members of the Council. There are no other reasonable explanations for the need to turn the Security Council meeting into a NATO get-together. It is a pity that Copenhagen, at the end of its watch, decided to demonstrate open disregard for the Council's procedures and practices, putting NATO's national position and interests above the duties of the UN Security Council President, who is tasked with being the guardian of procedure and pursuing a balanced and impartial policy. Madam President, we all watched how the European sponsors of the Kyiv regime hesitated to request another meeting on Ukraine this month. On the one hand, they really wanted to tick the box in March. On the other hand, it was important not to set themselves up and not to create the impression that the EU and the UK are trying to undermine the efforts of the United States and Russia to end the Ukrainian crisis. As a result, already on the flag, when March was almost coming to an end, London and Brussels nevertheless decided on such a move, using as a pretext the letters of the permanent mission of Ukraine regularly sent to the UN Security Council with unsubstantiated allegations about Russian strikes allegedly carried out on civilian targets in Ukraine. As we have repeatedly repeated, the Russian aerospace forces strike only at those objects that are related to the military potential of the Kyiv regime. Therefore, civilians in Ukraine, as a rule, suffer either from the wreckage of downed missiles and drones, since the air defense of Ukraine, in violation of the norms of IHL, is deployed in residential areas of Ukrainian cities, or from the fall of anti-aircraft missiles, which they then try to pass off as the consequences of Russian strikes. The Kyiv regime is not very convincing because the Ukrainians themselves, despite the strictest ban on the punitive bodies of the Zelensky regime, record and publish arrivals on the network, and thus refute the propaganda fabrications of their authorities. It was thanks to such publications that the attempt to pass off the explosion of a school on March 24th in Sumy as a deliberate strike by the Russian aerospace forces on civilian infrastructure was debunked. The footage widely distributed on social networks shows how, after a small fire in the center of a residential area, similar to the consequences of the fall of a downed drone, suddenly there is a large-scale detonation of ammunition stored in one of the buildings next door. The involvement of the Kyiv regime, which stores ammunition in residential areas, in this incident turned out to be so obvious that even the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, had to correct his post on social networks about the alleged Russian strike that caused the explosion. But the Ukrainian mission to the UN, which laid down this episode in its letter of March 24th and called it a Russian missile strike, did not have time to correct anything, and thereby she set up her European curators, who also actively referred to this incident today. Here is a clear example of how the Security Council is trying to manipulate and feed its members with false information. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of such examples. At the same time, European guardians of Ukraine point-blank do not notice the crimes of the Kyiv regime against civilians in Russia. As you know, European Commissioner Kallas, who briefed us recently in this hall, shamelessly asserted that there are no such casualties in principle. Let's leave it on her conscience, which apparently she just does not have, and cite statistics only for recent times. In just 1 week, from March 17 to March 23rd, 150 civilians were injured, primarily in the DPR, Belgorod, Kursk, Kherson regions, and the LPR. 16 people were killed, another 134 people were injured, including 4 minors. And 2 days ago, on March 24th, in the Lugansk People's Republic of the Russian Federation, as a result of targeted shelling of a civilian car by the armed forces of Ukraine, 3 representatives of the Russian media were killed. The military correspondent of the MIC Izvestia, Alexander Fedorchak, the cameraman of the TV channel Zvezda, Andrei Panov, and the driver of the film crew Alexander Serkeli. 2 more correspondents were seriously wounded. Today it became known that in the zone of activity of Ukrainian sabotage groups in the Belgorod region, Channel 1 correspondent Anna Prokofieva was killed. Cameraman Dmitry Volkov was seriously wounded. Where is the condemnation of these crimes by the Western public and the UN? Or do you think that the murders of journalists, if they are Russian, are something that can be left unanswered? However, we are already accustomed to the fact that the death of Russian people in Europe, gripped by Kyiv Russophobia, is not considered a crime. We all remember how, since the unconstitutional coup in Kyiv in 2014, when nationalists and neo-Nazis came to power, Europe and the West have generally been silent, and when Russians were burned in the House of Trade Unions in Odessa, and all 8 years while the Kyiv regime waged war against the peaceful Russian-speaking population of Donbass. So we should not be surprised at your unscrupulousness and selective deafness, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, we took the situation into our own hands and launched a special military operation more than 3 years ago in order to end this war of the Kyiv regime against our compatriots. Madam President, today, with the new Republican team in the White House, led by President Donald Trump, coming to power, there is indeed hope that the Ukrainian crisis will finally be resolved with a sustainable and long-term peace. All that was needed was a sound assessment of the situation and political will. Resolution 2774, adopted by the UN Security Council on February 24th, to the gnashing of teeth by our European colleagues, was a kind of embodiment of this change of course. Of course, we are only at the beginning of the road, while Russia and the United States are only groping for understandings in which the whole world is interested. Our leaders, ministers, and expert teams have resumed communication and have already achieved very remarkable results. For example, yesterday, following expert talks held in Riyadh, Russia and the United States agreed to start implementing the Black Sea Initiative. It concerns ensuring the safety of navigation in the Black Sea, the non-use of force, and the prevention of the use of commercial vessels for military purposes. As we all remember, it was because of such actions by the Kyiv regime that the previous similar attempt failed. In order to avoid further incidents of this kind, provision is made for the organization of appropriate control measures through the inspection of such vessels. In addition, the United States pledged to help restore access for Russian exports of agricultural products and fertilizers to the world market, reduce the cost of shipping insurance, as well as expand access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. It is important to understand that, according to the agreement, the initiative is resumed after the implementation of a number of measures aimed at lifting sanctions restrictions on the Russian Agricultural Bank and other Russian financial institutions involved in international trade in food and fertilizers, including their connection to the SWIFT system. The removal of a number of other restrictions from Russia is also envisaged. In addition, Russia and the United States agreed to develop measures to implement the agreements of the presidents of the two countries on the ban on strikes on energy facilities in Russia and Ukraine for a period of 30 days, starting from March 18, 2025, with the possibility of extending them and withdrawing from the agreement in case of non-compliance by one of the parties. Russia, as you know, has been adhering to this understanding for more than a week, which cannot be said about the Zelensky regime, which seems to have agreed with it in words. However, just 3 hours after the announcement of this, the Kyiv regime attacked with 3 drones an energy infrastructure facility in the village of Kavkazskaya in the Kuban, which ensures the transshipment of oil to the pipeline system of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. And on the night of March 23rd, an explosion occurred at the Sudza gas measuring station in the Kursk region, through which gas was pumped to Europe, which was then under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. On March 23rd, the armed forces of Ukraine launched a massive artillery strike on an electrical substation in the Zaporozhye region, leaving 11,000 people without electricity. On the night of March 24th, the Kyiv regime launched a drone strike on the Kropotkinskaya oil pumping station of the Caspian Consortium. In the afternoon of the same day, the Kuban branch of PJSC Rossetti was attacked, due to which the Rostov NPP Tikhoretsk power line was turned off, and the Svatovo gas distribution station was attacked in Lugansk, and a drone was intercepted in Crimea, the purpose of which was to equip the Glebovsky underground gas storage facility. By the way, the Kyiv regime tried to attack it this morning. In addition, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked energy facilities in the Bryansk and Kursk regions with drones today. In other words, Kyiv, having agreed in words to an energy truce, continues to plan and carry out strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure, trying to deceive both us and the United States. It is quite obvious that by such actions, he seeks to disrupt any peace agreements, clearly demonstrating his inability to negotiate. Russia reserves the right to respond if this destructive line of the Kyiv regime continues. Madam President, disrupting the settlement process launched by Russia and the United States and drawing its European allies into a confrontation with Russia is the last hope of the leader of the Kyiv regime to keep himself and the corrupt elite loyal to him in power. As you know, in March, Zelensky's Kursk adventure actually ended ingloriously. To date, more than 90% of the territory of the Kursk region, which the Ukrainian Nazis invaded in August last year, has already been liberated. Its price, as many warned, was catastrophic for Ukraine, which lost more than 70,000 people killed alone and hundreds, if not thousands, of units of equipment supplied by the West. As a result, the combat capability of the Ukrainian army was undermined. The country is losing more and more territories in the east, where, due to the lack of reserves transferred to Kursk, the front has practically collapsed. Despite absolutely barbaric and anti-constitutional methods, the military mobilization is stalling, and Ukrainian men captured in the streets and forcibly thrown to the front refuse to fight and surrender at the first opportunity. The prospect of elections and retribution for all the crimes committed against his country and his people loomed before the Kyiv prince. In addition, he will have to account to the West for the stolen billions allocated to support Ukraine. This is Zelensky's worst nightmare, and to avoid it, he is ready for absolutely anything. He is not afraid of new casualties among Ukrainians, nor the danger of provoking a conflict between nuclear powers. Therefore, he desperately maneuvers, lies, deceives, and contradicts himself, seizing any hope of prolonging the agony of his regime, which has turned Ukraine into a concentration camp and a private military company fighting for illusory Western geopolitical interests. But he will not succeed, and the Ukrainian crisis will find its long-term solution. Today, thanks to the efforts of the presidents of Russia and the United States, there is a real chance that this decision will be diplomatic and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives of ordinary Ukrainians will be saved. Of course, the military scenario remains, and we are also ready to implement it. But we prefer peace and diplomacy, as we have consistently stated over the past 3 years in every statement we have made in this hall. And what do you prefer? Should we continue to feed PMC Ukraine with weapons and try to prevent the settlement of the conflict, or should we still stand on a par with Russia and the United States and find a long-term solution that addresses the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and strengthens security in Europe and around the world? The choice is yours. Remember this when the party of war, raging in some European countries, will try to disrupt the efforts made by Moscow and Washington and offer the overdue Ukrainian president another, potentially fatal for this state, adventures. Thank you for your attention. Madam President, since you have allowed yourself to answer me, I will allow myself to answer you. Referring to bad examples is a very bad practice. This further undermines your efforts as President of the Security Council. In addition, one of the events you mentioned, namely in February, was held at the ministerial level. You are well aware of this. After all, we are adults in this hall. Let's not look for childish excuses for our mistakes, but simply admit them.